Okay, good morning, everybody. Today we're going to have a ROCKE-3D seminar that we're hosting here in our GIST building for maybe the last time. We'll see how that goes. Uh, and I'm really delighted to have Paul Byrne, an old friend of mine for many years now, who is a professor in the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department at Washington University. And he's going to tell us all about why he thinks plate tectonics have existed, do exist today, or in
Yes.
previous aeons on Venus. So take it away, Paul.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Lovely to be here, everybody. This is my first, hope not the last, maybe. Visit to NASA. So yes, exactly. The idea of this talk is to share with you some ideas for work that a bunch of us have been doing for a while. That is, I think, increasingly pointing to the fact that at some point in the geological past, Venus had something akin to what Earth had in the Archean, in terms of lateral mobility, some kind of mobile tectonics. So I'm going to build up to that by I'll start introducing Venus. I think most people here will know this, but I think it's always helpful to just start from first principles. Venus is an Earth-sized world. It's 82% Earth mass. It's 95% Earth radius. Right now, as I understand it, we cannot readily detect or distinguish an Earth from a Venus in another planetary system a few tens of light years away. Which of course means that it's difficult for us to be able to articulate whether or not Venus or Earth is the likely outcome for a fairly large rocky world around a main sequence star such as our own. And that has huge implications for all kinds of things, including the habitability of our own world, because I think it's difficult for us to understand how Earth has managed to maintain its clemency for virtually its entire time. And a big question maybe should be whether or not Venus is the more likely outcome of the world. It orbits about close to 3/4 the distance, so it has about twice the solar insolation or the insolation that we do. Whether that plays a role in its climate history is a big open question we don't have a good answer to yet. But I'm going to present some observations that are geological in nature to get at the idea that there are things on Venus that are difficult to explain beyond the sort of normal processes that we recognize on Earth. So even if we're completely whack and way off with this, we're still lacking an explanation for the features we see on the surface. That's the kind of the gist of this. Okay, you probably don't need me to tell you this either, but I'm going to summarize it, right? We have a tale of two worlds. One scenario for Venus is that simply by virtue of its proximity to the sun, it was never able to cool down enough. It was not able to condense the steam in its atmosphere that was decast from magma ocean, and that steam was not able to condense into rivers and lakes and seas and start a proper hydrological cycle on Venus, such that this world has been a barren, dry, hellish hellhole for virtually all of solar system history. Scenario one, in which case the dominant control is its proximity to the star. Scenario two is that Venus was, perhaps because of cloud-induced albedo that was able to reduce the surface temperature enough to get it below the condensation point of water. There was a lot of water on the surface, and if there was, the planet was able to regulate its temperature for a time and perhaps even be blue, right? And I do a lot of work studying Mars and the geomorphology of Mars. There are open questions as to whether or not Mars may have had a global ocean. I don't think there's very compelling evidence for that. Water certainly was present in liquid form on Mars, but I think probably more as lakes and big muddy vast deposits. There are, I think good evidence from mud volcanoes in the northern hemisphere of Mars. So I don't think Mars was ever blue. Mars was always probably red, and maybe it had some more water vapor clouds. It was kind of whitish, but it was never blue. I definitely don't think it was ever green. However, in the context of Venus, I'm not sure it was green, but I do think it was blue. Certainly, there is at least possibility that it had oceans. And if so, then we have to invoke some other mechanism for how it ended up the way it is today, which is something that I know you've worked on and we can talk about later. If Venus had managed to condense this atmospheric water into essentially seas, then there is a possibility, given its size, that it would undergo what we call mobile lid tectonics, which is the very broad, loosely defined form of mobility of the outer brittle shell that the planet Earth has had for almost its entire history. Maybe not plate tectonics. I'll get back to that later in the talk, but because the phrase plate tectonics triggers people. On that very note, there is no evidence today preserved on the surface of Venus for there being plate tectonics. And the things that we look for when we would define plate tectonics geomorphologically would be things like very large subduction troughs, large connected networks of what look to be divergent tectonics, and then connecting those huge transform faults, the very existence of which is predicated upon this process of spreading and subduction happening on a ball. And so you need these large transform faults to accommodate this thing happening on a sphere close to it. And when we look at the topography of Venus, so this is a radar Magellan image. Everyone knows that this orange color courses, radar data are black and white. So you could make this any color you want. They could have made it bright green and they didn't. They chose orange because I guess the thinking is that the rocks are orange on the surface. They're probably not, they're gray, but anyway, who cares? This is the topography of Venus, right? Such as we have it from the Magellan altimetric topography. The topography is kind of lousy compared to what we modernly now have for, say, parts of Mercury or Mars or the Moon, but it's enough for us to see where the high bits are and where the low bits are. And I'll talk through some of these high and low bits in a moment. But what we do not see here are extensive linear troughs. We do not see chains of ocean volcanoes, although I'm not sure actually we would see them even if we were there. But we definitely do not see giant transform faults that are accommodating plate tectonics. So the signature of plate tectonics is not preserved in Venus to date, at least not the modern style plate tectonics. And this is an important question. This gets to the idea of what do we mean by plate tectonics? In the sense of we understand this for Earth today, we're talking about the balance of force between mantle convection being able to move stuff on the surface and stuff on the surface being rigid enough that they remain plate-like over large lateral distances. These are torsionally rigid blocks, but they are so big that you can have the Pacific plate, which occupies about 45% of the surface of the planet. And also that when these things actually they're not so rigid that they can't be bent. And when they are bent, they stay so that they are able to pull themselves into the mantle, right? Because this process of slab pull is what's driving about 70% of the force driving plate tectonics. Now, as I will come back to, this style of mobile lid probably did not operate through all of Earth history. But what did happen for much of Earth history, and we know this on the basis of really old rocks in the Archean, is that there were definitely evidence for rocks that were certainly we see deep sedimentary rocks that are metamorphosed, which means there were oceans and it was possible to get material onto those oceans. We know that some of that material was terrigenous, so it was coming from land. So we know there was land back then. We also know, this is an important point that ties into what I'm going to talk about for these highlands. If you drive down a plate into the interior and that plate is full of sodden sediments, and that water will come off that plate and it will metasemize and change the composition of the rocks above, you get large volumes of felsic melt, or basically granites and granitoids. And those are the things that make up the continents. And once you produce that material, it generally stays around. It does not get subducted. That has led people for a long time to hypothesize that perhaps, because we do not see continents on any other world in the solar system. We see highlands and lowlands, we don't see continents as we understand on Earth. It is worth pointing out that Venus has a few highlands. It's got two big ones in particular. It's got this vast expanse here, low latitudes in the eastern hemisphere called Aphrodite Terra, which itself comprises some smaller chunks I'll label in a moment. And there's a big thing up here in the north called Ishtar Terra. And these two terrae are continent size, but interestingly, they are elevated relative to the mean, planetary mean, which is sort of this kind of bluey purple color. Most of the planet is lowlands. And they may be consistent on the basis of geophysical data with being a little lower in density than the material around them, which would be consistent with them being felsic. We have no direct measurements of what the hell this stuff is made of, and we are not likely to for a while at the scale we would want, because getting onto the surface is easy, but operating on the surface of Venus is exceptionally hard. And I think we are, until we have high temperature electronics readily available that these things can operate for months at ambient Venus conditions, it's a hard sell, I think, to get funding for a 2-hour lived lander, even if the science is compelling, versus a long-lived something else. So we're not going to know for a while. We also are going to get improved gravity and other geophysical data sets from the upcoming missions, which God willing will fly, Envision and Veritas in particular. But we cannot get the kind of quality data we would like for Venus that we could say have for Mars or the Moon, because we can't get a spacecraft low enough because the atmosphere is so dense, so thick. So we are going to have to wait a while to figure out what the hell these are. In terms of other bits that are worth pointing out, first off, within Aphrodite, there are two other areas that I want to highlight, which I'm going to show images of in a few minutes. One is called Ovda Regio, and one is called Thetis Regio. There are also a few other places that are worth pointing out. There's this area here. I think you can see my mouse. This is called Tellus Regio, and a place down here called Alpha Regio. They're not as elevated as the two big highlands, but they are relatively elevated. They are pretty big. This area here, Aphrodite Terra, is about the size of South America. And then Ishtar is a little smaller, but it's bigger than Australia. So these are substantial chunks of land. These areas up here, Talus and Alpha, are smaller, but they are still not modest. They are certainly Central Europe and a lot bigger. So these are large contiguous areas. Alpha is of note because that is where the Da Vinci probe is targeting for its descent. It'll somewhere land on the eastern half of, or the western half of Alpha Reggio. I'll show you a photo of that in a moment. But there are other highlands that are worth talking about. I'm going to mainly focus on the really big terrae, but there are other elevated places. There's also a few other places which I don't label here, like for example, there, and actually down here as well. Those areas are elevated, but we think they're elevated for a different reason. We think they're dynamically supported. That means that there's a big welding up of hot material from the mantle that's supporting that. So it's dynamic topography. And the thinking goes that at some point that welding will go away and that topography will relax down. Whereas these things, these chunks over here, they are not dynamically supported. They are just sitting there. So they are long-lived.
How is that known?
On the basis of the apparent depth of compensation with the geophysical data in terms of the isostasy. These things here look like they're supported by a very deep-rooted source, which is consistent with this upwelling. And the geology is consistent too in terms of what you can see in the radar. Whereas these things are slightly, we think basically like they are lower density and they're thicker. So they're high standing and they do not require that kind of, there's probably some flexural isostasy, but generally they don't need to be supported otherwise they're just sitting there. So there are qualitatively different kinds of highlands on these. So what I want to talk about too with these highlands is that much of them, not all, but much of these highlands, not these ones over here in the Western Hemisphere that are dynamically supported, but most of this, of Ishtar and Aphrodite and Tellus and Alpha and a few other places are, I'm not even sure what word to use, covered. They display a morphology on the surface that is called tessera. So I have to tell you what tessera are. One thing I will tell you is that we don't know what they are. And I personally do not like this phrase because it is not a geological word, in my opinion. It is used for the geology of Venus, but there's no useful distinction or definition for this word. It was invented by Russian scientists in the 80s to explain highly deformed, high radar backscatter textured material. So the kind of qualifications to be tessera are strongly deformed terrain and high radar backscatter. So this is a portion of the western part of Alpha Reggio, near where the Da Vinci probe will touch down. The scale bar is about 160 kilometers. So the image is around 350 kilometers square, or to a side. So it's a big region. The big black thing is a data gap because we have often in the most interesting places, no data.
Almost exclusively.
Yes, it's really
So where did that word came from? I mean, some of them just invented that out of the blue.
Yeah. I mean, all words are invented, right? But we have,
Sure, yeah,
but we
I'm
have a
asking-
bunch of words to describe stuff that, you know, why would we need to invent new ones? So
Yeah.
originally for the first, so the Russians were the first to fly an imaging radar at Venus, right? So we had radar altimetry from the Pioneer Venus probe, but very broad scale topography. Did not really have images in the sense that we have now. And when they detected this, they flew in the high northern latitudes up near Ishtar, and they saw this really high deformed terrain, and they called it parquet terrain at first, like parquet flooring, right? And then the story goes that the lead engineer or the lead scientist for that group did not like that phrase, and they wanted to have a more formal, not a floor texture word. So they invented tessera, which is related to the word mosaic, right? And so, because you can see tesseration is a word used, for example, describing like North African mosaics. So it is a word. But it's not a word applied geologically to any other world in the solar system.
So I'm asking because in Greek, that's the number 4. And I was wondering whether that makes any sense.
That has nothing to do with it. But is yet another good reason why this is not a helpful word, right? And because, and so like when I show you here, strongly deformed terrain.
Or maybe if you have Greek, then it can be quite quadru and
Some could be.
So I think it came from tiling. That's where they wanted to try and convey the idea, right? But the problem is that there is sort of a working definition for tessera, 2 or more sets of what we interpret to be tectonic structures at high angles to each other. And that's a fine thing, but tessera is more, you kind of know it when you see it. It's a very unsatisfying way to define something, but more to the point, when we talk about what tessera are, originally the term, as coined by those Russian scientists, was to describe a surface morphology, a surface texture. And even within this image here, admittedly covering a fairly broad area, there are some places where there's a very kind of pronounced fabric, tectonic fabric of north-southish sort of stuff. And then over here, it's kind of all higgledy-piggledy, and then there's some gray splotches. I mean, I'm not sure how I would quantitatively describe this terrain, right? But it is definitely different to the lower backscatter, darker stuff off here on the western margin, which we generally interpret to be volcanic plains. Now, there are vast expanses of radar dark material in Venus that do not in any way look like volcanic plains, but we don't know what they are. They could be large sedimentary deposits. We just, the radar is not the same as an image, and it does not give us compositional material or information. It gives us a little bit of information by way of the dielectric constant and the backscatter value, but generally speaking, we just have shape. When folks have mapped this, and there's the standard for the global geologic map for Venus is by Ivanov and Head, published in 2011. This is a map of the tessera, the greeny yellowy stuff. So this is a map predicated upon looking for parts of the surface that display a texture similar to the one on the left, right? But there are some places within even relatively small spatial extents where the texture looks quite different, but it's still itself different to the pretty flat-looking, boring plains. So we call this tessera. The problem is that the word is often taken as a shorthand to mean some kind of geological unit, and it ain't. There is no requirement that it is the same stuff everywhere, or that it was made at the same time, or deformed at the same time, or deformed by the same process at the same time, or a different time. We just know the rocks are deformed. There have been papers published where there's these really big areas. Remember I told you there's these two big highlands, Aphrodite and Ishtar, that are kind of covered in or display this material. There's talus, there's Alpha, there's a bunch of other bits of it, and there's lots of small little chunks of it sticking out with plains around them. And that even led to some proposals in the late 1990s that maybe there was a layer of this tesserated material all around. But geologically, that doesn't make a shred of sense, because what we're seeing in the radar data are consistent on the basis of analogy with Earth for faults and folds. And they are indicative of substantial tectonic deformation. How in the hell would you deform an entire shell? There's no mechanism that would do that. If you push it together in some places, you should be pulling it apart in other places. So it doesn't make any sense to be a layer of tessera. And it would be wrong to even think of it as a layer. It's not a geological unit, because on Earth, we're trained to think about units. Sandstone comes down, limestone comes down, but that's probably not true for virtually any other place in the solar system. So we are trying to figure out how we approach this in first principles and what we can explain from it. Now, I'm going to presage some of the stuff I'm going to show you by saying that I said there's no evidence for plate tectonics in Venus today. There is evidence for stuff happening probably in the past that is at least consistent with huge lateral motion. So there's a paper that came out about 11 years ago. Lyle Harris and John Bedard have this really interesting sketch map where they look at an area called Lakshmi Plain. So remember I told you there's two highlands. There's Aphrodite at the equator, there's Ishtar up in the north. There's a huge plain as part of Ishtar Terra called Lakshmi Plain, right? Lakshmi's plain. And this thing is a big elevated thing, and it looks like Tibet. And what these guys did was they got the eye in and they started mapping the structures around this thing. And when they do with detailed structural mapping, so you basically what that means is you use the radar to look at the faults and the folds, you measure the orientations of them, you measure the sizes of them, and you try and pick together a history of how things got the way they are. When you do that, they argue that it matches very closely what you see in the Himalayas today, what's called indenture tectonics, which is this idea that as the essentially Indian plate moved up and collided India with Asia, in doing so, it crunches stuff and a bunch of stuff skidded out the right-hand side. Right? That's escape tectonics, and those are indenture tectonics. And we understand this pretty well. And we've mapped this, and we can study this on Earth, and we can do seismic arrays. So we understand the geology of this, and it's been happening in the last few tens of millions of years. It's what's basically keeping and up the Himalayan plateau. It's what's allowing Everest to increase by height by a couple of centimeters every year. That looks like this stuff you see in Lakshmi Planum's margin. Now, we have no ability to put long-lived seismic sensors or GPSs, and we can do vector analysis to work out which way things are moving. All we have is I'm looking at pictures at radar, and I'm looking at these, and I'm mapping their structures, and I'm comparing them. That's all we have, right? But it's as good as we're going to get for the next while. On the basis of this argument, Lakshmi looks like it slammed up into the rest of Ishtar. It's kind of weird. There's a paper by Marty Gilmore and Jim Head from a few years ago where they look at Tellus Tessera, which is one of the smaller elevated regions in the Eastern Hemisphere. And they get the eye in here, and what they do is they look at these tessera areas, which is sort of the qualitatively the lighter gray stuff. And they see that in some places, a lot of the structures, the folds and the faults that make up the tessera texture, go one direction. And then in another place, they go a different direction. And they are not strain compatible. So if I have a big chunk of rock, or really any granular material, but usually rock in this context. If I push it in one direction or pull it in one direction, I produce other structures of different orientations in a very predictable way. And we can map this, we can measure it, we can replicate it in the lab, we can computer model it. And often if we have structures that are at odds with each other, that are not so-called strain compatible, what that means is that at different times, these things formed under different stress regimes. And one way, I think the most obvious way to explain this is that they were originally not beside each other and got pushed together. And that was the interpretation of Gilmore and Head, that this thing was essentially assembled from antecedent blocks of this material that came together. Now, I think they miss the main finding. They were looking at through the lens of stuff welling up and down, because the prevailing wisdom for 30 years is that there's no lateral stuff. There never has been lateral stuff. It's all vertical plume-induced tectonics. Give me a break. So these things look like they came together somehow, somewhen. All right. So this got me thinking, well, is there more evidence for this someplace else? And how would we try and quantify this? Now, another thing that I'll be thinking about is, one of the things we see on Earth is that we have elevated regions that are thick and slightly less dense than the material around them, that are heavily tectonically deformed, that form the interiors of the highlands on Earth. We don't call them highlands on Earth, we call them continents. If you live on land and you're a land person, you might think of a highland as an elevated portion. But if you look at the entire hypsometry for Earth, the continents are the highlands and the ocean floors are the basins. We don't think of that way because we're not fish. Okay, but on land there are highlands and lowlands, but they constitute together highland standing areas. So I've been thinking for a long time is, how do I explain these so-called tessera regions on Earth in the context of geology that we might understand? That's a working hypothesis. Is there some kind of analogy or counterpart that we could look at? And verily, I say yes, there probably is. Right? If you look at places like cratons, which I think most of you, if you're from America, will say cratons, but that's wrong because they're from the Greek, meaning strong. Craton. The idea is that these things are the interiors of continents, and they're really old and they're really heavily deformed. So this is a Magellan SAR. So we're looking at similar kind of radar data to what we see on Venus, but this is in Canada. This is none of it in Canada. And what you can see is there's a whole pile of areas where it's very heavily tectonically deformed. There's lots of lines that go this way, and there's some lines that go that way. And those lines don't emerge independently. They are tectonic structures. Rocks do not form with these lines. They form very small structures inside them, but they don't make big structures, right? The scale here is a lot smaller. It's about a factor of 10 smaller than what you see. But I don't have the quality of radar data to show you. Actually, the radar data are too good for Earth compared to what the lousy stuff we have from Venus. So I have to show you much smaller things, which has big implications later I'll come to. The dark stuff here, rather than data gaps, because we do not have data gaps for Sentinel, which is great, that's water. They're water, they're lakes filling in. But the point is, what they're filling in are pre-existing troughs. And what we're actually seeing is a set of big folds. So the upper bit of the fold is the land today, and the lower bit of the fold, the syncline or syncline, is where the water is. So we have a fold system that goes that way, a fracture system that goes that way, and fractures that go that way. In fact, most rivers are tectonically controlled. So often you can look at where the hydrology is and you can back at the structures from it. This is a really old chunk of rock. And it's been eroded and it's exposed, and there's a whole pile of hydrology which you can kind of see through, but you end up with high radar backscatter, high tectonic deformation. So I'm going to come back to this idea, but there are, I contend, places on Earth that qualitatively look like what you see inside the highlands on Venus. These things form in a very specific way, in a very specific chemical regime, which is going to be important. It's also worth pointing out that if you look at the land, so about 20% of the surface of Earth is land, but most of that land is not craton. The cores occupy 8% of the land surface area. The rest of it are shields and other terrains, some of which are felsic, some of which are mafic, that basically got together as plate tectonics produced the continents. The majority construction of which was in the late Archean into the early Proterozoic. But the cores are about 8% of the surface. The tessera occupy 7% of the surface of Venus, and that might just be a coincidence. But they are not the entire amount of high-standing terrain, but where they do occur, they are clustered in these areas of high-standing terrain in the main, and they occupy a very similar proportion of the surface of Venus as they do for Earth. Right? That might just be a coincidence, but that is something worth bearing in mind as we go. Now, I told you that there are these big highlands, and that the centers of these highlands are very deformed and look like the centers of continents on Earth, or at least portions of, where you have exposure. Things like you see in Western Canada or Western Australia or Northern Canada, or particularly some really good examples in North Africa, and I'll show you some of those in a moment. One of the things that characterizes how continents grew is that you have those cratons as cores, and then over time you add stuff to them. Right? You mash them up and they grow by agglomeration, essentially. Of course, how do you get the craton in the first instance? The craton itself is actually smaller chunks that came together, right? So it's cratons all the way down. And the cratons originally themselves are volcanic arcs. So think Indonesia or Japan or New Zealand, where you have a subduction. This is the story we think that it applies. You have a subducting plate coming in, or some ability of drawing water into the upper mantle. You produce felsic material in a chain of volcanoes that are underlain by this felsic crust. There's not much of it, and now you have an arc. But over time, that arc gets kind of curved and pushed in itself and wrecked. And then another one comes in and gets glommed on the side. Maybe it gets wrecked first, and then they combine. And it's like taking 4 or 5 different colored chewing gums and chewing them into your mouth. Eventually, they're indistinguishable. But actually, folks, like, for example, there are these things called the Altaids in eastern Russia, where people have essentially been able to reconstruct the volcanic arcs that go into its construction. So we understand this process works. And then you have these cratons. And what defines a craton or a craton is simply a mechanically solid object that when later you do stuff to it with plate tectonics, you are not transmitting stress into the interior. It's no longer penetrative. You're taking something else and you're bashing on the edge and all the deformations of the edge, but that interior core stays intact. And we know this. We know this from looking at, for example, what's basically happening in terms of the burial depth of these minerals. We know that they do not undergo repeated recrystallization or dynamic recrystallization over time, because once you make this, it's largely left alone. And in some instances, they're buried and they're exhumed again. But in some instances, like the Altaids, they were never buried. They got made 2.5 billion years ago, and they've been basically at sea level since. They didn't really have anything on top of them that got exhumed away, a few bits, but there's not much material on top of them because it was never there. Some of these things just sit there, and although the plates are moving and churning, they just bounce around. They are no longer playing an active role in cycling stuff into the interior. So that's an important thing to think about. But on the edges of continents, you see growth, and arguably it's going to continue happening, but it'll just do so at a pretty low rate now because the heat engine is slowing down. But there are places where you see the edge of something and you have material that's glommed on the side, and eventually then they become unified. There is some really interesting stuff you see around the edges of some of the highlands on Venus. Not all of them, only a few of them, but several tens of thousands of kilometers of linear length where you see this process happening. One example here is in Thetis, which is part of that larger equatorial highland called Aphrodite. So I'm going to step through a few things that are worth pointing out, but let me give you just a general context for what we're seeing here. The brighter stuff is what we would call tessera. The dark stuff up here, by the way, the reason it's bright, for those of you who are not that familiar with radar data, is that radar backscatter value, so how bright or dark it appears, is principally a function of 2 things: the roughness of the material and the dielectric constant, which is some process or property of the rock that governs, or whatever the hell the material is, that governs the amount of radar energy that it absorbs or that it reflects. But to leading order, it's roughness. And so that means that if you have a really rough terrain at the wavelength of the radar, which in this case is about 13 centimeters, if you've got really rough terrain, it'll be bright. If you've got really flat, for example, like water, almost none of that energy goes back to the sensor. And so it's very low, dark radar backscatter. This is the method how, for example, we know that there cannot be ripples more than about 0.5 centimeter on the lakes on Titan. The image cannot remotely get to that spatial resolution, but if there were ripples, it would be kind of speckledy gray. And those lakes on Titan are virtually black. And that can only be the case that if there is any kind of rippling there, it's lower than the wavelength of the radar. So you actually get a lot of information from the radar, even if the spatial scale isn't that great. These data look pretty sharp here, but again, to show you the scale bar, which is pretty small here, that's about 300 kilometers across. So this is not a giant area, but it's not a small area. You'll note that there's dark stuff in the top upper left. They are radar dark, almost certainly volcanic plains here, because there are weird splotches that are consistent with what radar image plains look like on Earth that are volcanic. All right, so we're pretty happy that's the volcanic material. Then there's this bright stuff down here, which is the tessera. And there's this kind of mess of crap between the two. But one thing I want to point out to you is if we look at the structures here, we can begin to try and unravel at least an interpretation for what we're seeing. So in this first box here, this is not quite the tessera and not quite the plains, but we see a bunch of these looking things. The radar illumination in this direction is coming from the bottom right. So these are sort of folds or things sticking up. And I appreciate that they may not look like they're dropping down, but just trust that I'm not lying to you on this Monday morning. These are things sticking up. We interpret these. There's only a finite number of ways you can make a ridge on a planet. And one of them is you make a fold. Okay, presumably Sure, someone could have poured concrete. That's pretty not the case here. These are also gigantic structures. I mean, these are big ass folds. I mean, these are, actually exactly kind of thing you see in the Sichuan Basin or in the Jura Mountains in the foothills of the Alps. I mean, these are like classic looking foreland thrust belts. But there's a whole pile of structures. And the point I want to make to you is that they sort of go this direction. We call that the tectonic fabric, but the strike of the fold axes here is to the top right, to the northeast. And they've got a certain kind of spacing. And then we look in this area down here, and we see that there is now some thinner folds and some broader folds, but these things are still going in that kind of direction. They're still going to the top left or the top right then. And then when I show you this place inside the tessera proper, we still see this kind of ropey looking texture, except the folds are now much closer together and they're bigger, but they are still going up to the top right. Their angle is a little different, but not all that different. If you go from the planes, where picture 1 is, all the way through to these things here, there is no obvious place where you can draw a line and say, this is where this process stopped, and this is where the process started. There's a big ass set of lines in there you could draw there, but here, if you follow the map all the way up through there, there's no one obvious place where you would draw a line. You might be tempted to draw a line on the basis of radar backscatter. That's gray and that's less gray. You could do that, but that's in and of itself utterly meaningless geologically. It might tell you that the rock are somehow different, but it might just tell you that the radar roughness is different. In the same way that if you were to image a talus slope, which we have on Venus, there are places where the radar color changes very dramatically, that you might be tempted to draw a line as a unit or contact. But in fact, what's actually happening is the blocks are getting a different size, but it's the same stuff all the way down, but the radar can't tell. So you've got to be careful in terms of how and where you draw your lines and why. But on the basis of the structure, there are thin, small, low-strain things that go to the top right there. There are bigger, fatter structures that go to the top right here. And I don't see a structural boundary between the two. And that is one of the definitions for how you would take a large terrain and glom it onto the side of something. And a good example of this is the Appalachians, right? Where you see a bunch of smaller folds and a bunch of larger folds that have the same, what we call strike or direction or trend. And the only difference between them is that we now know that the ages are different because we can explore the rocks. Remotely, we can't. Morphologically, we just see a progression of strain from one part to the next. So this resembles things like the Appalachian margin or any other large margin where something got glommed on. And if we're right in this, and there's a few other places where we've seen this, the implication is that highland has grown because whatever is making up that darker stuff up in the top, some sort of plains material, is being crunched and deformed. First a little bit and then more, until eventually it becomes completely indistinguishable from the actual main highland itself. That's the structural interpretation of what we're seeing here. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago that there's this big thing called Lac-Chu-Plan, this big plain that's smashed up in the north, and there's this other place called Tellus where it looks like bits were sort of built together. Arguably, the forerunner of all of this was a 2-page LPSC abstract written in 1994, which was never any follow-on, by Shadwick and Schauber. And I still owe the guy an email. I presented this at LPSC last month, and I got an email during the talk from John Chadwick going, "Oh my God, it's my abstract from 30 years ago. We should talk." I guess we should. The semester finished on Friday, so I haven't had time to follow up with him yet. But he and Schauber basically, what they did was they took this map of Ofta, which is a big chunk of that equatorial highland, and they drew a bunch of lines. And what they did was they said, there appear to be different textures and orientations of structures in these blocks that are delineated by the lines we've drawn, but no one had recognized this before. And they even say in this abstract, this resembles the patchwork quilt-like way in which continents are assembled. And they for whatever reason, they never followed up with it. So I'm like, well, I'm going to run with this now. I'm going to see what I can see. So what I've done is I've overlain it crudely with a portion of the global mosaic we have from the Magellan data with their lines, with their long coordinates. You can see these beautiful black lines that streak down here where the thing started to crap out towards the end of the mission, so we don't have data for there. But we do have pretty good coverage. I mean, to be fair, this is a 1990 to 1994 mission flying cobbled together early 80s radar bits. I mean, it was essentially a Frankensteinian mission, right? The Venus Radar Orbiter, it was called. Back in the day, I run the data archive for NASA that archives these and many other data. And back in the day, people, if they want those data, would either have to come visit WashU, or you could put a request in and they would put onto CD some files.
9-track tape.
9-track tapes. See, my dad has 9-track tapes. I don't know what about that. But like you're talking about CDs. I mean, now you can just put this 200 gig file on your computer and just power around in Arc Pro, and it's, you know, it's a different era, right? And who knows what we'll have in 30 years hence. But it's not easy, but it was not easy back then to sort of get these huge gobs of data and compare them. And also for a variety of historical reasons, the Venus community got pretty small after the Magellan mission, mainly because of lack of funding. So a lot of these ideas were sort of being worked on, and they sort of stalled out for a while. And now this is the perfect time to revisit these ahead of what we think are going to be these new amazing data sets we're expecting within the next 10 years. So for the interest of time, I wanted to step through one particular place, but there's several of these that I've looked at, and I have a grad student now who's, this is the focus of her PhD. I want to look at one of these boundaries between one of these. I could have taken any, and I've looked at about 5 of them, but I'm going to take this area here that's highlighted in this pink box and zoom into it. So this is it at a better spatial scale. This is Eastern of the Regio. And there's a few things I want to point out to you again. The black bits are just gaps in the data. So first off, again, the scale bar here is about 250 kilometers. So this is a 500 kilometer-ish box. I mean, this is a big, big region. This is like, you know, France into Germany kind of thing. There's this kind of texture here. So this is all tesseract. But even having, if you've never looked at tesseract before, for the sake of 1 minute, you can see that it's not the same material or the same appearance everywhere. There's this kind of fairly well-pronounced, sort of very fine-grained stuff that goes this way and stuff that seems to go that way. I'm going to use the word stuff as a sort of an encompassing term for fractures, folds, faults, lineaments that we interpret to be tectonic in nature and not depositional or principally erosional. And then on the right-hand side of the image, there's a crater. This is kind of weird. I don't know how to describe it. It's a crocodile thing or egg carton texture. On Earth, if you look at Norway along the fjords, you see exactly this pattern because they're folds, they're intersecting fold patterns. And this is generally the interpretation for these things on Venus, that we are seeing what is called fold interference patterns. Imagine taking a big chunk of rock and folding it one way, and then later folding it, or even potentially at the same time, folding it a different way. You get very complicated patterns of highs and lows. Now on Earth, the lows get filled in pretty fast, either by sediment or water. But on Venus, not so much, although there probably is some sedimentary infill. But the point is, this texture is different to that texture. And they are not strain compatible. They are not consistent with this whole region got deformed by the same process at the same time. And then between them, there's this lower area, which is probably why it's a little darker. It's highlighted here by this, the pink dashed lines each side. This material could be slightly darker because if it is lower, and it looks like it is, again, topography quality isn't great, but it looks like it's a little lower. You can imagine sediments being deposited in there, and those sediments are going to be finer scale. And so they'll make things a little darker. And that's when we're testing. We don't know that for sure yet. I should also point out, by the way, that I told you these vast expanses of lower radar backscatter darker stuff we interpret to be flows on the basis of being volcanic flows in other places. There are some places where it could be Lego bricks would look exactly, it's probably not Lego bricks, but we don't know what it is, right? It could be sand because the radar cannot distinguish. It can just tell you how rough it is and what its dielectric constant is. But between these areas, you have a very strongly pronounced tectonic lineament or tectonic fabric that kind of goes up to the northeast or to the north. The actual orientation is probably not that important. Just recognize that there's a bit here that looks different to a bit there that looks different. And between them, there's a very well pronounced set of lines. And if you get smaller little postage stamp areas, you see this very well. You know, we map this, we measure it, and we try and work out what the kind of relative timing of these things is. On Earth, there are plenty of places where you see different tectonic fabrics that are touching. So just to emphasize, this is a weird looking texture, and that's a different kind of weird looking texture. And they do not appear to be tectonically consistent or compatible with one another. This is an area, again, in Nunavut, and this is an area I love looking at because we got good radar data. It's been heavily geologicalized in terms of people have gone there and mapped and measured, and we know what it is, and it's exposed. It's not covered in forest, so you can see stuff from sand. It's worth pointing out that this area here on the right, high radar backscatter, again, this is Sentinel SAR radar data, very well pronounced fabric of rock. So fabric is a word we use in tectonics to describe usually a penetrating set of structures and lineaments, folds, fractures, and combination thereof. But there's a very well pronounced set of things that go up to the top left. I hope you can see that. And then on this side here, it's not as well pronounced. There's some stuff up here that kind of goes north-south. Here, it's kind of flat. I mean, there's a little bit of hydrology happening here. There's some structures that are filled in here with high radar backscanning material. But they are qualitatively, they look different. That white, very well pronounced stuff does not extend across that dashed blue line. And we know on the basis of getting out there that the stuff, the sort of middling gray stuff here on the left, this is Mesos Neo-Archean rocks. These are metamorphic rocks. And they date to about 3 to 2.5 billion years old. And this really high backscatter stuff here is Cambrian to early Ordovician. And it's about 2.5 to 3,000, 2,000 to 2,500 years younger. 2.5 two numbers are difficult. There are many years between them. So there are different kinds of rock with different geological history. They are vastly different in age. They are touching each other, but the only reason they're touching each other is because of plate tectonics. And in fact, the boundary between them is, I have not gone here yet. Getting up there is logistically difficult, but I have tooled around on Google Earth a lot. The boundary between those two blocks is about the width of a river. It's about 30 meters across. And it's a river because there's a big tectonic. There is a huge structure going deep into the lithosphere there. And there's a bit of erosion and the river is in there. That's how you could tell the terrains, those big rivers between them. I'm from Ireland. There's a humongous suture that is essentially the River Shannon that picks out these two blocks that were originally thousands of kilometers apart. So the point is that on Earth, you can find bits touching that have different tectonic fabrics. And even the boundary between them is literally about 100 feet across. But that boundary was originally an ocean. And that ocean is gone. And there may even be several oceans in there that are gone. I mean, our planet's incredible in what it can do. So it's worth thinking about, do we see exactly the kind of morphology on Earth that I think we're seeing in Eastern Opta Regio? Our contention is that, yes, this is Central Algeria. Now, I've gone to multispectral image data here for a couple of reasons. One, I think the structures are a little easier to show. They don't look that different on radar data. But two, we don't have great quality radar for all of the portions of Africa that I'd like. Now, maybe we do and I haven't found it yet. But the take-home shouldn't get in the way of the conclusion here. This is an area where we have these two different blocks of different textures and a relatively narrow area between them. Now, again, I told you this is 500 kilometers across. The scale is gigantic. In the Earth example, this image is about 100 kilometers across, right? So it's much, much smaller. But this relatively low-lying area filled in with some sediment where there's a very strong tectonic fabric of material that parallels the margins of this boundary zone. This is a terrain boundary. And the reason there's this lineaments thing going on here is because these are really tight folds. They are folds of rock where it's been bunched, and the folds are probably on top of huge thrust faults, which is when one chunk of rock gets pushed up over another. And on the basis of the fact that people have gone and done geology here, we know the stuff on the left is Neoproterozoic, and it's intrusive material. So it's basically felsic granitoid material that got eroded down and exposed, and the stuff on the right is much, much older. Now, unfortunately, it's referred to as Precambrian. This really gets my goat. My geology training, it turns out, was the Phanerozoic of Western Europe. So the story ends in the Cambrian, and everything before then is sort of incidental. Of course, everything before then is 90% of Earth history. So that's why on the maps we have right now, we've a French Geological Survey global map for continent scale map for Africa. This is Precambrian sediments and volcanics that date from 4,500 to 500 million years. So not exactly super helpful. But the point is that we do know that these are different age materials and they are different types of rock. They're kind of browny gray now, but they are touching, and their terrain boundary is only about 10 kilometers across in places. But between them, there were oceans that are gone. Just like you see in that example in Nunavut that I showed you. This is what we think is happening here, right? This is at least the modern plate tectonic mode. And I'm going to talk about how that might be a little bit different in a moment. But the idea basically is that you have two chunks of land, and they are basically continental crust, and there between them is an ocean. And that ocean is oceanic crust, which is more rigid, thinner, and able to bend. And as that stuff, it's also more dense, which is arguably the most important thing. And as that process bends, and as that plate bends, the two chunks of land come together. And in that process of producing that, as that plate moves down and it's dewatering and it's producing this metasomatism in the overlying mantle wedge, it's generating chains of volcanoes. And over time, you get successive chains, and then you get these inert ones as the melting point moves. And eventually, these things get compressed on to the thing that's already the existing ground. They become these abandoned magmatic fronts. This is the ground. It's not all that thicker because often there's erosion helping plane it down. But the point is, you go from an active magmatic front to an inactive magmatic front. You have a trench. This is the oceanic lithosphere. And when that lithosphere basically runs out and that process comes to an end and subduction stops, you are now left with two bits of land that are touching. And in some cases, the boundary between them is only a few tens of meters across. But there could have been thousands of kilometers of ocean between them originally. Now, this is the modern sense of scale. And one thing to point out, this is a strain ellipse here. So this circle, there isn't really a circle under the ground. But if you look at that circle and then you deform it, you end up with a very highly strained circle. And the way you're accommodating all of this pushing together is you are either going to push stuff up or push stuff down. And you don't really push stuff up very much because it gets planed off pretty. You do push stuff up, but it gets planed off pretty effectively because erosion is pretty fast on Earth. But you end up with a very thick root underneath your continent like this. And we know this is under the big orogenic belts you see on Earth, where you have continent-continent collision or continent-ocean collision and eventually continent-continent collision. And we know on Venus that at least the highlands, although they're elevated, they're elevated relative to the global mean, but they themselves are pretty flat. You do not get very large excursions in elevation or in topography on those elevated regions themselves. And we know that they're thicker. At least we think we do with the quality of the geological data, geophysical data we have. The question is whether or not this process ever operated on Venus. Now, again, I want to be clear. This is what's happening in this. This is like Proterozoic to Phanerozoic plate tectonics, where the plates are big enough and rigid enough that you get the Pacific plate. This probably was not what it looked like on earlier Earth when you had a higher heat flux in the mantle. The plates probably weren't as big. And the process, the strain rates, the rates at which this is happening are probably faster. But we know you have got to have had vast lateral motion, or you're not going to get bits that on the basis of paleomag started off tens of degrees apart from each other and they're not touching each other. Right? That simply couldn't have happened. So the argument is that at least for some of the highlands on Venus, we see evidence morphologically that is consistent with the growth and the accretion of material by some kind of plate-like process, a plate tectonic-like process. Probably not what Earth has today, but probably, at least I contend, what Archean Earth had back in the day. Now, we have no idea about the timing or the age of this process on Venus. We have virtually no reliable age constraints. But Occam's razor, if nothing else, says that if Venus had the ability to cool itself down, why would the two large, similarly sized worlds not operate under a very similar regime, at least for a time? And if we are completely wrong and we're off totally the wrong direction for explaining this process, the kinds of deformation that leads to what on Venus is called tessera, and what I call flying over Greenland or Canada, just deformed rock. We don't have a word for that. We just have old wrecked rock. That texture doesn't appear anywhere else in the solar system. So how the hell else are you making it on Venus? So the contention is, if we're right, if there was some process able to assemble material, potentially it's felsic, potentially it's granitic and continental, but we don't know that. But at the very least, the only way you can take two chunks of rock and put them together over vast distances is mobile lid tectonics. Maybe it's not exactly plate tectonics today, but it's whatever the hell was operating in the Archean. And the thinking goes that for that to happen, you have had to have a water, because we do not have a reliable mechanism to be able to bend a plate down and have it drive under and be lubricated over thousands of kilometers. Because if we did, why don't we see this on Mercury or the Moon or Mars? We don't. And if you had liquid water on the surface, that has profound implications for Venus's climate evolution and also Earth's, as to why in the hell we still have a relatively clement atmosphere. So I like to tell people that the road to understanding both how planets form and how you attain and sustain planetary habitability goes through Venus. And that's the talk. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you, Paul. Any questions in the room here?
Yes.
Go ahead.
So I'm no geologist, so I might say stupid things here. But if there was plate tectonics and there is none now, there is a point where it stopped.
Yeah.
And there is a process that hid the solid evidence for it, which might have been the deformation on the surface, right?
Yeah.
So can you comment on that?
I can conjecture wildly. And the good thing is, I think this is all testable by technology in the 2200s. So the stakes are low. Okay. Okay, so you're dead right. If it happened at some point, then it stopped. And you remember I was showing you these pictures here. On some of the contention we have is that some of the areas where we see this kind of growth of the highlands, I think this is happening today, or at least happening in the geologically recent past. And I have a paper right now where we're working through a review where one of the reviewers is like, you can't just say geologically recent. What does that mean? Because on Earth, that means whatever. I'm like, I don't know what it means. I just know not old. Because that's the constraint we have for Venus. It's very unsatisfying. This is not the same scale as what we're seeing in the construction of the Archean on Earth. And the reason I think this is happening today is because I think the stratigraphically, to the extent that there is a stratigraphy of Venus, the stratigraphically youngest materials seem to be involved in this process. And stratigraphically young, I don't know what that means, but let's say younger than 100 million years, probably much younger. But I think it's unlikely the planet was doing something until 100 million years ago and then just stopped. It's given its size and its age, that's unlikely. This is more, I think what this is closer to continental drift. Right, the idea that you have these things moving around with no explanation for how, just that it explains why South America and Africa seem to fit together, right? Or how you have speciation and you have different, why the Byrne in Clare in Ireland looks the same as Newfoundland, right? We don't know how, but we know that it is. In the case of continental drift, it's stuff moving around. And if you do not have subduction of continental drift, then if you are opening or pushing or pulling apart one place, you're pushing together with somewhere else to balance them. It is worth knowing that where we see this crunching today, or I'm not saying it's happening today, but I think it happened relatively recently, along the whole other southern margin. This is the northern margin of that highland. Along the southern margin, you have a huge rift system. So you can actually explain this in a modern Venus context by what I think Venus is doing today is it's trying to do plate tectonics, but without liquid water, it can't. But it can shuffle and jostle stuff around. It just can't dive stuff in anymore. So it also means that it can't draw the CO2 out of the atmosphere as nearly as effectively as it would otherwise. So I think this is like the modern remnants of this mobile lid regime. And I think Venus is in a mobile lid regime. It's also probably in places in a static lid regime. In the same way that I don't like these terms at all, because stagnant lid, I mean, these were designed to convey heat loss. I mean, Earth has mobile lid in the plates and the plate boundaries, but in the continental interiors, it's completely stagnant lid. There's no tectonics there, right? And it's pure conduction and the flux is low. So that's what it's doing today. It was doing something different in the past. At some point, there was a transition. We don't know where or when or why. Although Mike has published some potentially, you inject a whole pile of CO2 really fast from large volcanic eruptions, you could overwhelm the plate tectonic or the basically silica carbon cycle. And if that's the case, you could trigger a runaway greenhouse in that case, and then you evaporate the oceans and you lose the ability to lubricate those plates. And the process stops. But the interior, the mantle of Venus doesn't care that it's around a star. It doesn't care that there's oceans. It doesn't know. So it keeps going. And you were saying about, like, could you bury the evidence for it? What I find really weird and a little upsetting is that if you take my friend, a graduate student of mine calculated this about a couple of months ago, and I'm not sure anyone's ever published this, and I'm not sure you could publish it because it's just one line, it's one equation. It's not an equation at all, it's just maths. If you take Earth's eruptive rate today, which is a little bit on the land and most of it in the sea at spreading centers, if you just had that, you assume nothing else changes, but there's no oceans. Let's say you boil them off from a runaway greenhouse. It takes about 70 million years to fill the oceans in. That's all. 70 million years. That's nothing geologically. So if if space aliens came down and told us that Venus had plate tectonics until 500 million years ago, if you take Earth and you turn off plate tectonics, you boil the oceans off, and you let the mantle just do what it's doing, you will basically make Earth look like Venus in within 100 million. It's very fast. So what I would love to be able to do, which is not 2200s, this is 50,000 years away. I would love to peel the upper few kilometers of the plains off. And maybe instead we use very high power ground penetrating radar, or we have a very comprehensive seismic network. Okay, that would be probably cheaper. But I would love to know, and my hunch is, this is not scientific, this is more like a gut feeling, that there are buried huge transform faults and buried fill-in subduction troughs and buried spreading centers all across the lowlands. There would have to have been to accommodate the deformation that we see preserved in the highlands today, which is similar to, if you fill in Earth's ocean basins, you are going to have a hypsometry that will look like Venus. You are going to have some generally low-lying areas and some highlands. Those highlands are generally going to be around the same elevation, and they're going to be highly tectonically deformed. Turning Earth into Venus is actually not hard and doesn't take that long. That doesn't mean that Venus was like
That's
Earth.
very reassuring.
Yeah. So those emails you feel you got to do, don't bother, right? Venus, but what it means is that this does not in any way prove what happened to Venus, but it does mean that in the parameter space, you could say it is permissive of Venus looking quite different, potentially not that long ago.
And the key thing is the lubricant.
The water does two things. It lubricates the plates. It also weakens the rock because once you introduce those hydroxyl
Right,
molecules,
solutions.
yeah, exactly. And you also start jamming in hydroxyl molecules into the crystal lattice, which weakens it, so it becomes easier to concentrate
Or you
strain.
break the crystal structure.
Yeah, yeah. It does a few things, but that's one of the things that it does. But the biggest thing is that it lubricates. Now, I post this on Moz Twitter, now I post on Blue Sky occasionally. And every once in a while, some rando geologist who studies the Himalayas is like, oh, there's dry subduction in the Himalayas. And I believe that there is. But the rates and the amount are really low. Could you drive some stuff in? Yeah, probably for a while, but you sure as shit can't do what the Pacific is doing, right? And it seems very unlikely that you can eat up 10,000 kilometers between two completely different age blocks and put them together without there being oceans in between. So the idea, again, Occam's razor, if someone else comes out with lab experiments that says supercritical CO2 can act as a lubricant. Well, then I would say, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense because we would then see something approaching modern plate boundaries on Venus, which we don't. So, yeah, I think all things being equal, it was water. Yeah.
How much water do you need to lubricate the plates?
I have no idea. None. Not very, I have no idea, none. How much water? More than none. I don't know. So we know that Venus had a lot of water in the past. It has an elevated deuterium hydrogen ratio, which is consistent with having lost a lot of water. But the big unknown, and jump in if I'm getting any of this wrong, because my background is not climate, my background is stones. But the point is that generally speaking, that is interpreted to mean there was a lot of water loss. We do not know or cannot tell yet whether it was steam in a steam-rich post-magma ocean atmosphere, or if it was essentially vaporized liquid water oceans that became steam and was lost to space photo and then photodissociated. So the idea is that we do not know how much there was. You can make estimates for how much water there was, but I don't know if there's a minimum requirement in terms of like a global equivalent layer of 10 meters as a I don't know. Subduction happens at very deep places on Earth, partly because you get flexural bending that makes the subduction zone in the first instance quite deep. Like hence the Marianas Trench, for example. Not all of them are that deep, but I don't know if you have to have a deep trough. I don't know what the kind of overlying, what the driving water thickness is for that. But at the same time, we don't really have a great estimate for how much water is inside Earth or how much water Earth has lost. We do know that Mars, Venus, and Earth all lose about the same atmosphere every year, which probably puts pay to the idea that you need a magnetic field because Venus doesn't care. And what's probably a much more important thing is the ability to replenish an atmosphere that you lose, right? Because the mantle in Mars is largely degassed, it's not able to replenish itself, whereas Venus is no issue, probably through volcanism. But in terms of how much water there are estimates between something like 3 and 7 oceans worth of water left inside Earth's mantle, which will never see the light of day, most of it anyway. But we have no idea how much water is inside Venus. So it's very, very difficult to place constraints in this question. There are views that because the upper surface of Venus is very dry and because the atmosphere is very, very dry, there's the same amount of water in Venus's atmosphere as in Earth's, but the atmosphere is much, much greater. So proportionally it's much, much less. It's parts per million water vapor. But that is also consistent with a really high surface temperature. So we do not know how much water Venus might have had or might be born with. We also don't know how much water you need for plate tectonics. So oceans in the super qualitative sense is what I'm going to end with. Yeah.
So again, I also know nothing about geology, but would you expect these features to be able to survive through some kind of runaway greenhouse effect where you're maybe heating the surface of the planet up to or past the solidus or liquidus? Or this has to be a relic of after? It was never able to get that hot.
I don't know is the short answer. Certainly the structures we see are brittle, right? Which means that the rock can't go above its homologous temperature or get close to it. So, but I mean, people have also proposed that maybe the rock is kind of not squishy, but like it's not cold brittle. But the structures we see on the radar data are completely consistent with brittle deformation, implying the rock is in a brittle rheology in terms of its domain. So that has implications for its temperature. If you could unequivocally show that the runaway greenhouse, and so if we're in the post-runaway greenhouse now, and it's not as hot as it could be, that's fine. That explains the structures. If we knew definitively that during that climate transition we got up to the point where it melted everything, then I don't see how you explain these structures. Because I can't imagine they'd survive. So, but I also don't have a good explanation for how you'd make them post. Because A, we don't see them on other planets, and B, they are indicative of large-scale lateral motion, which in the main we do not see today because we do not see giant transform faults. So when I'm talking about slowly crunching stuff up, I think that is happening today. When I'm talking about taking two blocks that were super far away, I don't think that's happening today because we do not see giant transform faults cutting through those lava plains, for example. So on the basis of the geology, this had to have happened with large-scale lateral mobility prior to the onset of a climate transition. So I would say that should be a constraint on models of how hot the atmosphere got. But if you had an independent way of saying the atmosphere really did get so hot that it melted everything, then we're wrong. And this is all post runaway greenhouse. But I'm back to square one trying to explain how the hell you explain these structures.
But the lateral transform faults could be buried, right? Because the surface, we don't know the surface age of the basalt.
No, that's
very
true.
well,
That's true. That's
right?
true.
They
That's
could
true.
be, you've argued this, right? They could be 100 million years old.
Yeah, they could be. We don't know how old the plains are.
Exactly.
There is an average age for Venus given, depending on who you read, is around 700 million years.
Yes.
But that's not a particularly satisfying way of approaching it because my contention is that some of these parts are really old and some parts are really young. And so you're kind of lumping everything together and that isn't necessarily meaningful. Yeah, some of these lava plains could be extremely young. But if you had a situation where some of this deformation happened, at least some of it, after the runaway greenhouse transition, you still have to. So then you'd get to the issue of how are you allowing lateral motion for a while, but no longer? Because those transform faults presumably would still cut through even the youngest plains. And there's plenty of post-plains deformation, just none of it's consistent with huge lateral motion. So I come back to the idea that the geological constraint is that it never got so hot that it eroded those structures or erased them completely.
And do we know anything about the material of these? Or
No.
Just, we know the density is maybe, or did, I'm sorry.
It's really annoying. And we don't know the density. The way
Oh, we
we do
don't.
the density is we assume the density and then we look at the gravity. So we look at the gravity and the topography and we figure it out. And we can definitely say that the density to satisfy the gravity observations between the highlands and the lowlands is probably different. And the lowlands are a little greater density, which is consistent with these things being essentially like buoyant. We know the surface materials at the landing sites are, I'm not a geochemist and I'm a lumper, so they're basalt. The geochemists are like, oh, it's some sort of something weird form of basalt that you've never heard of, right? I don't personally care, it's all basalt. But it looks like you're taking a peridotite or periditic mantle and you're melting shit and stuff comes out, just like you see on Io and on Mars and on Mercury and on the Moon and Earth, right? So that's probably not surprising. Like basalt is like the standard rock you get, essentially, on a relatively large world. So that is to say that we know it's basaltic, but of course on Earth we know that ocean basalt and mid-ocean ridge basalt, they tell you vastly different important things about the different reservoirs and the mantle melt locations in the mantle. So we have none of that information whatsoever. If the highlands were felsic, meaning slightly more granitic, lower abundances of magnesium and iron and things like that, and more silica, which would be consistent with them being granitic, let's say. And therefore, here's the thing too, and this is an important point. I know you've got your hand up, so I'm going to come to you next. But long story short, granite is treated as a sort of like sacrosanct rock. It's like there's lots of it on Earth and there's almost none of it anywhere else. There is granite on the Moon, there's granite on Mercury, and there's granite on Mars. You can make granite if you have a huge body of magma and you let it sit there for a while and it cooks. You get what's called fractional crystallization, and all the really heavy elements go into minerals and they sink, and then the light stuff is left behind. And you can make 1 or 2% of that amount of material will come out as granite or rhyolite, and you get even a very basaltic lava flow. You can have some evolved melts, we call them, right, or silica-rich melts. But the point is, you get a 1 or 2%. These highlands are so freaking big that we cannot readily we cannot make it work. The amount of lava that would have to come out for them to be just purely from fractional crystallization is more than the material in the crust is known to be thick on the basis of the geophysical data. So we cannot rely on fractional crystallization to explain these things. And if we could, we would presumably see highlands made of this material on Mars and on Mercury and on the Moon, and we don't. So the thinking goes that this is something different. And again, Occam's razor, right, tying it into what we see on Earth. But do we know what the materials of Venus are made of? No, not really. Disappointing. At the back, you had a question.
Two questions. One, what's the resolution of the gravity data that you have now?
It's degree of order 180. So it's I'm trying to think of what the scale of that is. It's pretty lousy. It's several tens of kilometers minimum.
One might imagine that if you flew a more high precision gravitometer then you would start to see structures underneath the plane.
Oh, yeah. The only problem is you need to fly inside the atmosphere. And you can do that. You can fly above the clouds with a balloon, for example, which is this whole thing that I could talk about that I haven't yet. But to get really high resolution, you'd want to go under the clouds. You'd want to get down to maybe a few tens of kilometers over the surface where the temperature of the air is sufficiently hot that you would need high temperature electronics for it to work.
And the second question is more climatic. So if the well, it wasn't quite clear to me what order you were proposing here. Are we proposing that there was an ocean, there was plate tectonics, but then it got too hot and the water evaporated and then plate tectonics ground to a halt? Or did plate tectonics ground to a halt, which caused the carbon dioxide to go up, which then caused the water to evaporate and then...
I don't think we know.
So do we have a thought about the cause and effect?
Oh, we've plenty of thoughts about it, but do we know? No. So you're right insofar as I think there was some Archean Proterozoic-like plate tectonic process operating in the past that is not operating anymore. And that what's happening in the modern Venus is a much slower, sluggish, continental drift-esque thing. Why did plate tectonics stop? I think the most reasonable explanation is that the planet entered a runaway greenhouse state and it lost the oceans.
Right.
And in doing so, jammed the plates up. Why would that happen? I think the best explanation is probably not because of the sun getting slightly more luminous through time. And that's work that Mike has looked at. And I think it's more likely that a large igneous province or three kick off. And that seems to be quite an efficient way of injecting enormous amounts of CO2 very quickly geologically and overriding the carbon silicate cycle. And what's important about the LIPs is that I know that you've done work with like returns, for example, is that these things are relatively common on Earth. They are not well understood, as I understand it, in terms of where they come out or when function as a function of, say, where the plate boundaries are. These things are often interplate. We do know that the Siberian traps, for example, injected an enormous amount of CO2 that really borked the climate and led to the extinction of 98% of all species on Earth and many, many creatures. And if you had 2 or 3 of those go off at one time, the work you've done has shown that that would be enough to overwhelm the carbon silicate cycle. And you wouldn't get that CO2 down fast enough to prevent the onset of a runaway greenhouse. And then that raises an interesting question. Let's assume that I'm right for this argument, and the 2 worlds start off functionally the same, and that stellar distance doesn't really make that much difference, and they are both able to cool down enough. They're able to get those high albedo clouds, they get the surface cool enough, and they kick into some kind of carbon sequestration process. And they can regulate their temperature, and they're just going fine. And then one day, figuratively, a bunch of CO2 that's coming out way faster than it had been, and it overwhelms the climate regulation system on Venus. The question then becomes, was that something that was inevitable? Was it entirely stochastic, which it looks like they might be in terms of the rock record for LIPs? And then the question gets to what I was alluding to earlier. Why didn't that happen on Earth? Did we get lucky? Or did Venus get really unlucky? And the reason I think this is so interesting is because it has profound implications for how we understand our planet's habitability, especially given the fact that complex life is relatively new for a world that's had life for a long time. And as we start pointing these really good telescopes at large rocky worlds orbiting other stars, I am really interested in knowing how many of them are Venuses and how many of them are Earth. How many of them have a post-runaway greenhouse CO2-dominated atmosphere? How many of them have an N2 atmosphere, regardless of whether they have abiotic or biotic O2? I don't care. How many have a nitrogen atmosphere with some argon, and how many of them have CO2? Because I wonder if Venus and Earth started off because the Earth is the default. But it turns out that dynamically supporting that for billions of years is exceptionally hard. And that's kind of where I talked earlier about having hunches. How do you test this? You have really expensive telescopes and you wait 100 years and you gather the population scale data. That's how you test it. You get to Venus, you atmosphere measure, you measure the interior, you do seismic surveys. You can do all that, right? Maybe not technologically right now, but we know how to do it. But my hunch is that Earth is probably what you get when you get a rocky world. And Venus is probably what you end up with sooner or later. And remember, the thinking goes, the sun getting ever more luminous is going to turn us into Venus in about 1 billion or 1.5 billion years. Which means in 1.6 billion years, you could fill in those ocean basins with a mantle that's still producing plenty of melt and turn Earth into a Venus.
So what you're saying is that either we just got lucky or it's going to happen.
Yeah, I think so.
Still-
I thought that for modern solar constant, you cannot have greenhouse, runaway greenhouse on Earth.
We're talking about 2 billion years, it's much higher.
Yeah, of course.
So the luminosity
Right now,
would
it's
be good.
it's not surprising that Earth is the way it is, because even if you eject a lot of CO2, you will still not.
But if,
Anyway,
but if
no.
like, if the traps are stochastic and the Siberian traps are a bit bigger. Or you have two of them go off at the same time.
But I think it's still not enough. I mean,
I think, well, you've shown that it is.
I'm working on it.
Okay,
I-
hurry up.
I thought there were some.
Simulations are running.
Oh, okay.
I mean, here's the thing, if it's not the sun doing it yet for us, it's not clear that the sun did it for Venus, if it did happen. And so you have to look to some other process.
We
And
definitely show that.
and volcanism is an obvious, easy one to point to, right? It's unlikely to be, you know, if you burn all the fossil fuels we have, you're not going to get to that point, right? You're still not at PPC, right? Concentrations of CO2. But volcanism absolutely can do it. And volcanism is the dominant mode of heat loss, directly or indirectly for these worlds. It's the thing that controls almost everything, builds their crusts, punishes the atmosphere, and eventually kills the planet.
But I think the luminosity of the star does set like time.
It does, it does,
Yeah.
for sure. So if it wasn't going to be, if Venus had gotten on okay for a while, eventually the sun's going to do it, but it wouldn't have happened already
Yeah,
if
So
it was just luminosity. for
it
Venus.
basically says like, okay, you have to get plate tectonics and this carbonate silicate cycle going before this point.
Yes,
When the luminosity hits.
think of it this way, in a really kind of morbid way, and I'm sorry for bringing the day down, you guys, but like human beings live a finite amount of time and then they die. Right?
What?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, you guys. Until we get to the head in the jar thing, right? And but some people die sooner, right? Venus, you tell me, right? If it's just luminosity doing it, then Venus might have been okay still to today, and may not enter that stage until maybe not very much before we do. So it got killed earlier. And then the question becomes, how dangerous is it? And I think the thing that's the loaded gun is volcanism, right? And something else that's worth. So my original background is volcanism on Earth, not even planetary, although Earth's a planet. But when I study LIPs and I do field work and I look at these things, and then I study other planets, our modern large igneous provinces are pathetic in terms of volume and eruptive rate compared to what's preserved in the very early part of the solar system's history. Where like Mercury's crust was in place within about 50 or 80 million years, and it was the most effective crustal extraction of any of the inner solar system worlds, given its ratio, basically thickness of the crust of the mantle to the silicate portion. We're talking the first 200 million years of Mercury's history are gone. They're not preserved because they were buried. Now, you don't have giant basin saturation on Mercury the way you do on the moon. Mars's crust, the oldest rocks that we can find on Mars are reworked Noachian sediments from volcanic rocks that were there in presumably what was the pre-Noachian that just simply isn't preserved anymore. And I assume Earth and Venus were the same. I see no reason why they weren't. The moon is a bit different because it's a bit late. It didn't get made the same normal way most planets do. But the point is that volcanism, even in LIPs, is so small compared to what it would have been very early on. To the point where I assume Mercury had an atmosphere for a while, and maybe it rained on Mercury. I don't know, you tell me, right? Because it was pumping so much gas out that was gravitationally bound before the solar wind stripped it away, even with extreme UV, even if it's a short-lived million years or something, right? So these degassing rates are insane. And so even 2 LIPs doesn't seem all that unusual or unreasonable.
We calculated 30% chance for 2 Siberian traps in those.
30% chance, right? So you take 5 star systems, each of them with 2 rocky worlds.
I mean, could you make an argument that the collision that produced the moon, that kind of defanged the large igneous provinces that could have emerged, and that Venus is actually more likely?
Maybe,
Because,
yeah.
Eventually, all these things will pop up, and it's only if you uncork the bottle.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, the reason I don't like any explanation involving the moon is because it just feels like super special pleading to me. Because it's such an unusual thing. Well, the moon explains this, the moon explains that. But I mean, maybe it did. I don't know. There really isn't enough evidence left today for us to know what the Theia impact did to the mantle. Could it have uncorked it essentially, or allowed some of that heat to come out? But we do know that there was clement conditions within a few tens of millions of years of that impact on the basis of Jack-Hill zircons, which to me is wild. like within a few tens of millions of years, after essentially vaporizing the lithosphere and sterilizing it. Because of course you didn't have Earth and Theia. You had something that we don't have a name for, Antheia. The outcome of which is Earth and the Moon, right? It was a qualitatively different world, proto-Earth. But within 80 million years or 100 million years, like suddenly it's raining and you don't just have like zircon crystals, you have granite being made somehow and then being weathered away and eroded and put into sedimentary rocks and water within 80 or 100 million years. It's insane to me. So,
But then doesn't that suggest that that was a cooling event? I mean, once the shock of the explosion and everything melting and stuff, but effectively for the system as a whole, doesn't that suggest that it cooled the whole system down such that this was
I don't know, maybe the way how would you test that? I don't know how you test it because I don't know what's preserved of that era on another world that you could try and determine like what the melt rates were, the cooling rates. I do know from the numerical models that you get a lot of heating.
Yeah.
And people have gone the other way. They've proposed that there could be mantle structures and mantle anomalies today that are left over from this impact, like the LLVZs, right? So I don't know is the short answer. Maybe. My intuition says no, because of the sheer kinetic energy of that impact. Dumping that heat would be difficult through radiation. But I don't know. I'm open to the idea. If that's true, though, actually, here's a way of implicitly testing it. Get those population statistics for 100 Earth-sized worlds. And if one of them seems to have evidence for a large moon, and it's got a nitrogen-rich atmosphere today, then, and the rest are all Venuses, that would be consistent with an impact cooling things down.
Because I mean, you have like in climate, obviously totally different scales, but when we see El Nino events, right? You have a very hot surface,
Yeah.
right? But actually, it's reducing the amount of heat in the ocean.
Yeah.
So you have a decrease in the total heat content.
Yeah.
Associated with perturbations of warmth at the surface.
Yeah. I mean, a big thing that plays a role here too is like if you look at Earth's heat, the heat that comes out of the ground, once you go down a few 10 meters, right? So you get the sun out of it, right? The overwhelming majority of the rock on Earth has no idea that it's around a star or anything, just doesn't care. And the heat flux through that material, about half of it is accretional heat from when the planet was born, and about half of it is from the mantle radiogenic decay. And a long-standing assumption is that the inner solar system worlds have similar abundances of radiogenic elements. We don't actually know that. And so even if there were sort of stochastic differences in the protoplanetary cloud that concentrate them more here and less there, that also has implications for how much heat you're producing through time. Maybe Earth cooled off because it had lower radiogenic abundance than Venus did, for example. It's really hard to unpick all this. All of this sounds like special pleading to me. All of it. And the way to tell is to go to Venus and drill and core and measure and sample, but that's really expensive.
We just got to find hydrocarbons in the oil company.
We're going to go.
20 minutes late. Thank you very much. That
Thank
was
you
very
very much
exciting.
indeed. Yeah,
I'll end the Zoom session here. Thank you.
my pleasure.